Hey guys, it's Timothy here looking at the black cards from Amonkhet in this limited set review. Thanks for joining me. I know these videos run a little bit long, but I do love hearing from you guys, and if you have any comments on my review of the individual cards from Amonkhet, please let me know below so that we can go ahead and duke it out and see which one of us is right, and I'll meet you at pre-release and tell you why you're wrong. But not really. If you have any comments about anything that I say during this video, perhaps I misread something, which happens a lot before I actually play with the set, or if you think I'm just wildly undervaluing or overvaluing a card, let me know below so we can talk about it. Pre-release is coming up at the end of this week, so I'm going to try to push out as much of this review as I can, even though I can almost guarantee I won't finish the entire thing by that time. But you didn't come here to hear that, did you? You came to look at me go back over my review late in again, but not really. So we're going to skip past this part. If you're interested, it's on screen, but this is how I rate cards, with 10 being the highest, absolute bombs, and 0 being completely unplayable cards. And while it's always unfortunate, we do have a 0 in black, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree on this, even though it's the type of card that I think newer players, people who are drafting for the first or second time, become attached to. This card is Dispossess. It's 3 mana for a rare sorcery, rare being very sad here. You choose an artifact name and basically take all of those artifacts from your opponent's hand, graveyard, and library, and that's it. You exile them. Now, this is not a limited card. This was obviously made with standard in mind, but it's a card you should absolutely 100% not play in limited, and I'm under the impression after looking through this whole set, there really aren't even any artifacts I would board this in against. Maybe if my opponent had 5 copies of the same artifact or something like that, I would take it just for value. But when you play a card like this, you're usually just down a card, and even if you got something from your opponent's library, you're very rarely making them lose something from their hand. So it's just a really bad discard spell that was made for the purposes of standard, and most of the Amonkhet and Kaladesh artifacts that are floating around in standard. Stay away from this card when it comes to limited. It's an absolutely unplayable card. Moving along, not many sideboard cards, but there is one that we should mention here, and as I've mentioned in my other videos, sideboard cards with Cycle in are perfectly main deckable cards. This one's probably better from matchup to matchup, so it's the type of card that if you do include it in your main board, you'll be happy because it's really good against embalm creatures in certain matchups, and then you'll be really sad in other matchups where it just doesn't do anything, and that's where you cycle it away. But 1 mana at instant speed to steal cards from your opponent's graveyard is pretty nice, and it exiles them instead of shuffling them back or anything along those lines, so it permanently gets rid of certain threats. If your opponent is a heavy embalm deck, this is where this card gets really good, or if they have a lot of aftermath spells, this has extra value there. Otherwise, it's just a discard spell that you're going to cycle. It is worth mentioning at this point that black has a lot of payoff for cycling cards, so if you find that you have some of the cards you see later in this video that reward you for cycling cards, then I would be more inclined to include this card in my deck, but I'd be cycling it more often than I'm actually casting it. Moving along to our 2s, narrow cards. These are cards that I really, really don't want in my deck. The first is Lay Bare the Heart. 2 mana for a sorcery that your opponent reveals their hand, and you can take a non-legendary, non-land card from it and discard it. I do like that this hits a lot of different things, so it's some combination of duress and just like a Thoughtseize type effect. Very rarely will it matter that you can take a non-legendary card, although it is worth mentioning a lot of the artifacts in this set are legendary, including all of the uncommon shrines, which are legendary artifacts, in addition to the gods and a couple other random creatures here and there. I'm not sure if any of the lands are legendary, but I don't believe they are. Lay Bare the Heart is just a discard spell, and while yes, it will be good a good number of times that you play it, or at least it'll be annoying when your opponent plays it against you and takes your best card out of your hand, I really advocate for not playing cards like this because they are really terrible later in the game, especially when you're in a top deck war and you and your opponent are both searching for answers. When you draw this, it doesn't really do very much, and if your opponent just draws a better card, you'll wish you had anything else in your deck. They're decent early in the game as a form of hand disruption, but really, really bad in the late game. Trespasser's Curse. I might be undervaluing this one. I'm not entirely sure. There are some decks that this is probably very, very good against, but I think overall it's just a little bit of a weaker card. It's 2 mana for a curse, so you put it on a player rather than a creature, and the enchanted player loses a life and you gain a life whenever a creature enters the battlefield. under the enchanted player's control. So you enchant your opponent. Whenever a creature comes in, you drain a life from them, which is decent. This has some two-headed giant applications, I guess, but I don't know. Overall, it doesn't do anything to the board. It's just a constant stream of life loss for your opponent. It seems like if your opponent plays this on turn 2, it's actually going to do quite a bit. But again, later in the game, this is probably not a card you want in your deck because of how bad it is to top deck it when you really need some action or you need another creature. Although I will admit, this seems like a very big annoyance when people play it against you. It does seem like it stacks pretty well too. If you have multiples of these and you just stick them on the same player, then that can get really dirty. But overall, I'm not a huge fan of this card at the moment. While I do believe, just a little bit of foresight, I think my review of this card will go up over time. And then finally, Shadow of the Grave, which is kind of a really weird card. It's 2 mana for an instant that returns all cards that you cycled or discarded back to your hand. Rather, the cards you cycled or discarded during the turn you cast this, they come back to your hand. This is kind of a weird card, and while it seems like it can do some really cool things, and again, black has a little bit of payoff for cycling and discarding, I don't think it's a rare quality card, and I also think it's not really that much better than something like Torment and Voice, where you're essentially just discarding or using a card to get some extra cards back. Notice this doesn't let you just pick up cards with cycling, like the blue spell we talked about. The 4-mana blue sorcery that lets you pick some cards with cycling out of your graveyard. It specifically only works on cards that you discarded or cycled the turn you cast this, making it a lot more narrow. And I'm just not seeing a lot of turns where you're going to cycle off 2 to 3 cards and then also have 2 mana up to cast this. If that happens, then fantastic, but I just don't see it happening for the time being. Alright, 3s. Weak cards. Cards that people are going to put in their deck, but not really happy to do so. These are the type of cards that it's probably a sign your draft's not going very well when you know you're going to have to include these. The first one is Unburden. Again, if you want to cycle this, it's fine, but this is just Mind Rot, 3 mana to make your opponent discard 2. And being double black is kind of weird too. I guess the idea here is you're paying a stricter mana cost in order to have cycling attached to it. Unburden just seems like the type of card I just don't want in my deck most of the time. I'm not a huge fan of Mind Rot in general, even though I will admit Mind Rot's a perfectly playable card. It's just, again, discard spells seem to drop off later in the game. While they do sometimes have a lot of action against control decks. If your opponent's playing a lot of late-game creatures, you might be able to cast this at just the right time to strip them of some of their best cards. Painful Lesson. This is a card that really waffles when it comes to limited because it sees many forms. The cheaper it is, the better, but we see this card come up quite a bit, and this is probably one of the worst iterations of the card I've seen, being both sorcery speed, in general, having the loss of 2 life. It is worth noting that this card can target your opponent, so if they're at 2 or less life, then you can kill them with it, but that doesn't happen very often. I don't know why Sign in Blood couldn't have just come back, but 3 mana to draw 2 cards at sorcery speed is okay, and then losing 2 life isn't that great on top of that, but this is just your black divination, and if you need some more action, this is a perfectly playable card. I just don't think I'm too happy about it. Miasmic Mummy, I've got the, I believe the Italian translation here. For those of you who don't know, when it enters the battlefield, each player discards a card. This is the type of card that I'm not happy running in my deck unless I know there's a lot of combo potential with it. And there is. There are a lot of black spells that function from the graveyard or cards that have Aftermath that you want to specifically cast the graveyard portion rather than the portion from your hand. Not to mention Black-Red's archetype in this limited format is being almost hellbent or having very few cards in your hand, and this helps achieve that while also making your opponent discard a card. So there are times that I'd want this, but if I'm not using that to my advantage, then this is not a card I really want to include in my deck, since it's really putting me at a disadvantage by discarding another card from my hand. It is symmetrical, but I'm just not a fan of putting myself down cards for no significant payoff. One last thing to mention about the Miasmic Mummy is it does something interesting where it lets you play off-color Aftermath cards, and if you can discard an Aftermath card that you normally wouldn't be able to cast from your hand, you can cast the Aftermath portion from your graveyard if you find a way to discard it. Dune Beetle is, well, a 2-mana 1/4. I guess this blocks, and that's all I have to say about that card. Moving on, for one I really don't want to include on this list. Oh, he's not there yet. Never mind. Trial of Ambition is 1 in a black for an enchantment that, when it comes down, makes your opponent sacrifice a creature. And then, obviously, like all of the trials, it bounces back to your hand when a cartouche enters your side of the battlefield. So, Trial of Ambition, a little bit weird. But I think this is probably good when it comes to limited. Now, these type of edict effects that make your opponent sacrifice a creature are not really known to be that good in limited, because your opponent gets control over what they sacrifice, and this is a token heavy format, so they drop off in the late game the same way discard spells too. The more time your opponent has to build up a board and put creatures and 1/1 tokens and things like that on the board, the worse this card gets. Although I do admit it is a lot better when it's cast early in the game, since your opponent is going to have very limited options. They probably don't have a token generation machine or anything like that going, and they're going to be limited on what they can sacrifice. So you can really get them with this card at certain times, but in general, I'm not a huge fan of edicts in limited. This one does have a nice interaction with the cartouche, because I do think the cartouche in black is very good, and I do think being able to make your opponent sacrifice multiple cards is nice too. And Trial of Ambition is cheap enough that you can often cast it alongside other spells during the same turn. If not the cartouche, then something else. Nest of Scarabs is a card that intrigues me. I think it's good when it works. You just need the right kind of support to make it work. It reads, whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. Now, something to specify here with this card, it only triggers if you're the person who cast the card or activated the ability that puts the counters on that creature. If your opponent puts -1/-1 counters on your creature or one of their own creatures, this does not trigger. But there are a lot of sweet interactions with this card, including a lot of green and black creatures that put counters on themselves. Not to mention, if you ever spread out counters and put multiple counters on creatures at the same time, Nest of Scarabs will trigger for each creature that gets a counter, building a little army of insects. I think this card is a sweet little build around, and I think it's much stronger than a 4, but you need the right kind of deck to make it even a playable card. And if you just don't have a lot of counters floating around your deck, then it's not a card you put in the first place. Bantu, I hate that Bantu's on here, but look at the card. Is this just underwhelming to anyone else? I think this card's really only a mythic rare because it's a god, but let's look at it. 3 mana, 4/6, seems nice. Menace, indestructible, sweet. Can't attack or block unless a creature died under your control this turn. What? Like, that's such a downside to such a formidable body, right? A 4/6 Menace is strong. Indestructible seems almost irrelevant on that, but not truly irrelevant. But that's such a downside. You have to lose a creature before combat in order for this to attack or block. So you have to be killing your own creatures, essentially. If your opponent sees Bantu on the battlefield, they're not going to use their instant speed removal before you go to combat, meaning you have to kill your own creatures. Yes, he has the activated ability to sacrifice other creatures, but it's not like there's a lot in this format that wants you to be sacrificing things. There are a couple payoffs for sacrificing, or if you're very, very heavy on token generation, that's another way to do it. But I just don't think that's a huge payoff. It's like you have to lose your own creature to make this a creature. It's almost like a vehicle where you're using some other resource in order to make this a actual creature in combat, but it's worse than that in that you're actually permanently losing that creature rather than tapping it down for the turn or something. I think the only time I want Bantu in my deck is if I want the activated ability, and sometimes it'll have a nice little payoff of having a 4/6, and there are some sweet little combos you can do with this and a couple other cards, but I'm just not a big fan of this god. I think it's very underwhelming. Doom Dissenter, speaking of payoffs for sacrifice, and we have a 2 mana 1/1 that makes a 2/2 when it dies. Yeah, if you're using this for sacrifice fodder, it's fine. If it ever trades with an X1, that's fantastic, but I still don't think this is a card that I'm clamoring for in my deck. It's just a card that I'll shove into my deck if I'm really, really low on playables, or if I have some sort of sweet combo potential with things like Bantu or so on and so forth. Faith of the Devoted is another card, probably insane in Two-Headed Giant, not 100% sure, but you're spending 3 mana for an enchantment, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, you can pay a mana, and then each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. Now, I'll admit, if you're a very cycle-heavy deck, maybe you're blue-black, which is the quote-unquote cycle deck, of the format, then this can go pretty crazy and can drain an opponent out. In fact, this card by itself could be your whole game plan, your whole win condition, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. But again, it has to be a 4 instead of a higher rating, because you just might not have a deck with a lot of cycling. And on top of that, this is an enchantment that doesn't do anything unless you have other cards to go along with it. Very similar to Nest of Scarabs, where Nest of Scarabs wants a deck built around counters, Faith of the Devoted wants a deck built around cycling. So I think they're both very fitting, and ironically both 3-mana enchantments in black. So nice little build around here. Alright, moving on to our playable cards. We're going to start seeing a lot more cards on this list. 3-mana, 3/2 Menace. Perfectly reasonable card. We've seen this before, and it's decent in combat, even though a 3/2 Menace does die in combat more frequently than you would assume. Menace adds a little bit of an extra evasive bonus, but not a huge amount on a 3/2. Blighted Bat is a weird card, so to speak. It's 3-mana, 2/1 with flying, and you can pay a mana to give it haste. I guess the idea here is if you draw this a little later in the game, you can suit it up and get in there, but it's just a 2/1 bat. It's not really crazy. A 2-power flyer for 3 mana is a perfectly reasonable card, though, and I wouldn't be really disappointed to run this. I just not picking every single one that I see. Horror of the Broken Lands is a creature that could get out of control, but probably won't. 5-mana, 4/4 that gets +2/+1 whenever you cycle or discard another card. You can also cycle it for black mana. This is a type of card you won't cycle very often because it does have a reasonable body on the board, but it does have the extra bonus of being able to be cycled if you need to. This is the type of card that if you need to smooth out your draws or you need to draw more lands, you're happy to cycle it a little earlier in the game and make sure you can at least play Magic. And then if you don't need to make your draws better and draw lands, then you just hold it until you can cast it. It's still just a big dumb creature, and even though you can trigger the ability multiple times per turn by cycling a bunch or discarding a bunch, it's still just chump blockable, right? It has no evasive abilities, just a big vanilla common creature. Wander in Death is your Raise the Dead type effect for limited, which we see quite often. 3 mana for a sorcery that can return up to 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Can also cycle for an additional card. This is a neat card, basically black divination, so to speak, even though we already saw a black divination. Whatever, I'm sticking with it. You can cycle it off for 2 mana and draw a card right away, or you can wait till the late game where this is going to be really good and get 2 creatures back to your hand. This is the type of card I'm not fond of in limited, but I do like it when it's relevant, and in very grindy matchups it can be a game breaker, just giving you 2 extra relevant creatures to put on the battlefield. Even though you do have to have the mana to cast those creatures if you really want to go off. And Cyclone's pretty nice too. This also has the extra bonus of you can put creatures with Cyclone back into your hand and cycle them again if you need to. So lots of versatility to this card. Wasteland Scorpion's an interesting card. 3 mana, 2/2 Death Touch with Cyclone. I don't think you'll actually cycle this creature off very often, since it is a relevant body on board. It doesn't also seem like a 2/2 is really that much better than a 1/1 when it comes to Death Touch, but it does let you get through for more damage. A lot of times people are scared to block Death Touch creatures because they know they're going to lose whatever they block with, and that just means you're getting in more damage if your Death Touch creature has more power. A lot of times you'll just play this on defense though, and your opponent has to make that same decision with any Death Touch creature. Do I attack into it and trade or not? I like that this creature can trade up in a format where there are a lot of potentially really big creatures at common and uncommon. Dread Wanderer is your combo potential sack outlet, or sack fodder, I guess. Dread Wanderer is 1 black for a 2/1 that enters tapped. You can pay 3 mana, 2 and a black, to return it to the battlefield, and you can only activate this at sorcery speed and only if you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. Now that is a lot of downside. Enters tapped is a huge downside since it can't block the turn it comes in, and you're probably just sacrificing it anyway. Or activating that sorcery speed only is even worse. 3 mana to do that ability is quite a bit, and you have to have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. That's just way too many pitfalls to make this a relevant creature to bring back turn after turn. Why I do give this a 5 instead of a lower grade is that it is 2 power for 1 mana. And I mentioned this in the blue video as well, and I'll probably mention it a couple other times. There is a certain appeal to having 1-drops in your black decks, because the black creatures that we'll see in a little bit incentivize you to have smaller creatures to put -1/-1 counters on. and having a recurable threat that you can put those counters on is a nice little way to combo with them and make sure you're getting the full potential out of your bigger creatures. But this guy has so many necessary clauses in order to bring it back that I just don't think it's worth it. And then Pitiless Vizier, which probably higher up on the 6 scale than it is a 5, probably like a 5.5 or just a solid 6. It's a 4-mana 4/2 that gains indestructible whenever you cycle or discard a card. Very annoying for your opponent to play against. As long as you have open mana, they're going to have to consider whether or not they can attack into this or whether they can block it. And if you do cycle in response to blocks and this creature gains indestructible, you do get that card back from cycling. So it's almost like you got indestructible for free. This card's probably a little bit better than I'm giving it credit for, but I'm not a huge fan of the old 4-mana 4/2, and indestructible does absolutely nothing when it comes to -1/-1 counters, so he's pretty easy to kill in that regards as well, and that is one of the primary forms of removal in this format, so keep that in mind. Not completely a bomb uncommon or common or anything like that, just a solid creature that I'd be happy to play in a deck with a lot of cyclers. Alright, moving into the cards that I really like. Cartouche of Ambition, much higher on the rating scale than the Accompanying Trial. Cartouche of Ambition is 3 mana. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 in lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, you can put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This seems pretty nice to me. You get to shrink one of your opponent's creatures while making one of your own creatures bigger and give it lifelink. I'm a huge fan of lifelink on just about anything in this format. And on top of that, if you happen to have the black trial on the battlefield, you get to bounce it back, or any trial for that matter. This card, probably not insane or anything like that, but it can be used as removal or pseudo-removal. It makes a creature relevant in combat while also shrinking an opponent's creature. And the fact that you can potentially bounce trials back seems like it gives you a little bit of card advantage on top of that. Essentially draws you a card anytime you play a cartouche and bounce back a trial to your hand. Festering Mummy, your good old 1-drop, 1/1. When it dies, you can put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This is a better version of a lot of the cards that we see in this design space, and I like it quite a bit because same thing I said for Dreadwander, there's a little bit of a premium. Well, premium's probably a better word than I should be using, or a more glorified word than I should be using. There is a little bit of an appeal to having these 1-mana creatures, especially ones that can kill your opponent's creatures when they die. And this is also pretty nice as a 1-mana creature that can trade up with 3/2s and 2/2s by dealing 1 damage to them in combat and then killing them off with the counter. So a little bit of an annoyance on the opponent's side of the field, and a little bit of combo potential when it comes to sacrificing creatures or using them as basically a bearer of all your -1/-1 counter needs. Splendid Agony, 3 mana to distribute 2 -1/-1 counters among up to 2 target creatures. Or it does read 1 to 2 target creatures. Also at instant speed, this will very often function as a permanent -2/-2, which is enough to kill a good number of creatures. Also can be used as a combat trick, and occasionally can be used as a huge blowout to kill a couple different creatures in combat, or just a bunch of X1s if the situation calls for it. I do like this card also in combination with cards like Scarab Nest and Hapatro, where it gives multiple counters to different creatures at the same time, which can trigger multiple different abilities on certain cards. Ruthless Sniper, 1 mana 1/2, that gives a creature -1/-1 counter whenever you cycle or discard a card if you pay a colorless mana. This is a justified uncommon. It's a 1-drop, which I've already mentioned multiple times is good in black, and it has a very strong ability, especially if you have a bunch of cycling, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be that hard to get a bunch of cycling cards in your deck. I think this guy's solid. Gravedigger, back again. Gravedigger's always a fine card. I've been very rarely disappointed to have a Gravedigger in my deck. Those of you who don't know, 4 mana 2/2 that returns a creature from your graveyard to your hand. This does a couple cool things. It is just a 2-for-1, and even though 4 mana is a lot for a 2/2, getting your best creature back from your graveyard to your hand is a nice bonus. And on top of that, same thing I mentioned earlier, if you happen to get a creature with cycling back to your hand, you can just cycle that off and draw a card, which makes this a 4 mana 2/2 draw a card, and I'm never skipping out on a card like that. Grimstrider, another card that fits in the red-black shell that wants you to have very few cards in your hand. we're talking about a 4-mana 6/6 that gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand. So a little bit of an awkward guy. The less cards you have in your hand, the better it is. The more cards you have in your hand, the much worse it gets. This card is very, very good in the shell that it's designed for. And you're completely empty-handed, then yeah, 4-mana 6/6 is great, but not unbeatable. And you're now empty-handed. Your opponent's going to have to find a way to... or your opponent's not going to have to work very hard to beat you if you just have no options because you discarded your entire hand. And I do think a 6/6 is a good little payoff, but not enough that I'm willing to play empty-handed for the rest of the game. Soul Stinger, 4-mana Scorpion Demon, 4/5. When it enters the battlefield, you put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature you control. So the first of this type of effect, where you have to actually put negative counters on your own creatures, hence the 1-drops being really good, or 2-drops as well. When it dies, you can put a -1/-1 counter on target creature for each -1/-1 counter on Soul Stinger. So a lot of times you'll put the counters on itself, and then when it dies, you start putting those counters on your opponent's creatures, the same number of counters that Soul Stinger had, and it starts off with 2. This is also the type of creature that you're really happy to play other things and start putting counters on your own creatures if you're forced to. And then once Soul Stinger dies, you can use it as a targeted removal spell. And the wonderful thing about -1/-1 counters is if they don't kill your opponent's creature, they do shrink it down permanently, and there aren't any +1/+1 counters floating around this limited format in order to get rid of those counters. So your opponent's creature is going to be permanently stifled, if not dead. I like to think of this as a 4-mana 2/3 that gives -2/-2 when it dies, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable card. And then finally, for the 6s, Supernatural Stamina, 1 black for an instant that gives a creature +2/+0, and when it dies that turn, you can return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. For 1 black, this seems like a very, very strong combat trick. It guarantees that your opponent that your creature survives. In a kind of weird way, your creature does technically die and then comes back to the battlefield, which lets you use enter the battlefield triggers again. And it also gives you +2/+0, which is a pretty sizable boost when it comes to combat, meaning that your creature is very likely going to kill whatever it blocked or was blocked by, and then if your creature happens to die, you get it back, which is pretty nice too. You can use this in response to your opponent's removal spells, or if you know they're going to target something with -1/-1 counters, then you get to go ahead and dump it. Not to mention, if you kill one of your own creatures off with -1/-1 counters, you can use this to save it, as long as you do so before the counters end up on that creature. Moving on to the 7s, we're starting to get to the really good cards, the cards that I'm hoping to open at pre-release. Hoping to open. Stir the Sands is 6 mana for an uncommon sorcery that makes 3 2/2 zombie tokens. You can cycle it for 4 mana, and when you do, you get a single 2/2 zombie token. This is just a 6 mana 6/6 spread across 3 bodies, and there are a lot of payoffs for playing a lot of different zombies or spreading your damage out across a bunch of different zombies, which we'll actually see here in a second. And then this also functions as a 4-mana 2/2 that draws a card, which, as I said with Gravedigger, is just a good card too. I do like to think of this that way, as a creature that gives you a card when it enters the battlefield, rather than a cycling card that gives you a creature when you cycle it. Same kind of deal overall, but that's just a fine card. A 4-mana 2/2 that draws you a card that could also just be a 6-mana 6/6 later in the game is a lot of flexibility for an uncommon. Bone Picker, probably even stronger than it looks. 4 mana for a 3/2 flyer with Death Touch that costs 3 less to cast if a creature died this turn. And unlike Bantu, this doesn't have to be your own creature. There are a lot of really sweet turns you can set up where you kill your opponent's creature with the removal spell, and then you just cast a 1 mana 3/2 flyer. This is a really good card. And the wonderful thing about it is if you can't kill a creature the turn you want to cast this, you actually just get to play a 4 mana 3/2, which is a perfectly reasonable card as well. I do want to point out that this isn't really a creature you're going to see on turn 1 or 2, since it's going to be very, very hard to engineer a situation by turn 3 or 4 where you actually have enough mana to play a kill spell, remove a creature from combat, or I'm sorry, just kill a creature in general, and then pay the extra mana to play Bone Picker. But it is nice that if you trade off with a creature very early in the format, or very early in the first couple turns, that you can just follow up with a 1 mana Bone Picker and have a huge flyer on board. Baleful Amonkhet, another one of these counter-producing creatures, is 3 mana for a 4/3 lifelink, and when it enters battlefield, you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature you control. This is where your 1-drops start to really come in handy as kind of the bearer of your burden of -1/-1 counters. You're fine killing off your small creatures if you want the full potential out of this, and a 4/3 lifelinker for 3 is definitely worth it. If you're forced into a situation where you have to put a counter on itself, it's still not the worst thing in the world, and I think the upside is pretty high on it. And then finally, another zombie payoff here, Lord of the Accursed, 3 mana 2/3 that gives all of your other zombies +1/+1 and can give all of your zombies for menace for the turn for 1 in a black and tapping it down. If you're in a dedicated zombie deck, if you're creating a lot of zombie tokens, or if you're embalming a bunch, then Lord of the Accursed is a huge boon to your team of zombies. Not to mention they stack pretty well in multiples, and the tap ability to give all your creatures menace can be a game finisher in the right kind of board state. Alright, looking at the 8s, again, you're going to see a lot of uncommons here. Very rarely a couple commons. I do believe there's one black common that I am going to put on here. In fact, I think it's the only card. Well, then I lied. Alright, starting off with a mythic rare. Completely forget everything I just said. Cruel Reality. 7 mana total for a curse on an enchanted player, hopefully your opponent. At the beginning of that player's turn, that player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and if they can't, they lose 5 life. Now, this is an expensive card, and I see some really aggressive matchups where this actually just ends up being a little bit weaker than it looks. But for everything I said about sacrifice effects not being that great, doing it repeatedly every single turn can really just cripple your opponent. And if you play this after a board sweeper or after a point where your opponent just doesn't have a lot on their board, this is really going to mess up their plans for the rest of the game. They're going to have to find ways to generate creatures for the rest of the game, and if they don't, they're just losing life for the rest of the game, which means they're probably already losing, and now they've got an inevitability clock on them that's going to dome them for 5 every single turn. I would ignore the word Planeswalker on here because it won't come up very often, but if you can cast this, if you can ramp into it, or if you can play it after a situation where your opponent's lost a lot of creatures, it can really just lock up the game for you. Plague Belcher is 2 in a black for a 5/4 menace, so let's find the downside. When it enters the battlefield, you put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature you control, very similar to the Amonkhet from the 7s. And whenever another zombie you control dies, each opponent loses a life. Now that zombie thing won't come up too often, but it can dome your opponent for a couple extra damage throughout the course of the game, which is nice. It doesn't trigger off itself despite also being a zombie. And again, if you have to put counters on this creature itself, it's just a 3 mana 3/2 menace, which there's already a common 3/2 menace, and that wasn't an impressive card, so this won't be. But the fact that you can dump these counters on another creature and then have a 3 mana 5/4 menace seems pretty insane to me. So I like this card quite a bit. I think it is strong enough that if I saw it in a pack, I would first pick it a lot of times. But there are some other contenders for 8s that I would probably take over it. Cards like Cast Out are very good removal spells. There's Liliana's Mastery, also, which I think is a perfectly reasonable first pick to a draft. 5 mana for an enchantment that gives all of your zombies +1/+1, and when it enters the battlefield, you get 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. You're essentially getting 6 mana, 6 power and 6 toughness for 5 mana, and if you happen to have other zombies on the battlefield, it gets even better than that. And then finally, a common, like I was mentioning before I showed you all these rares and mythics. Final Reward is just probably one of the best removal spells in the format. It is the type of common that you see in the packs and you understand that black is open and you just start drafting black if you can. 5 mana to exile a creature. Very clean, very simple, and while a little bit expensive and a little bit clunky in multiples, is a fine answer to a lot of the huge bombs in this format, so long as they don't have hexproof. Moving on to the 9s, Archfiend of Ifnir. Let's be honest, this should probably just be a 10. It's a 5 mana 5/4 flyer. Whenever you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponent controls, and then you also have cycling for 2 on top of that. You're never cycling this creature. I said it for some of the Sphinxes in blue and some of those cards. You are never going to cycle this creature in limited. If you do, you're in a very, very bad spot. This is the type of creature you just want to slam it on the board and have a 5 power flyer for 5 with a huge upside and a decent toughness as well. considering a lot of the flyers in this format have 3 power when it comes to the commons and uncommons. So this is just going to get in there. This is the type of card you slam, you cross your fingers, hope your opponent doesn't remove it, and then you just go crazy with it the following turn. Sometimes killing multiple creatures off of this ability. This card just seems insane, and in fact, just looking at the card for about the 3rd time here, this should probably just be a 10. I don't see you losing a game where you get to resolve this and it doesn't get removed right away. And it seems a little cliche, but we are going to mention our 10 here, which I do believe deserves this spot. Liliana, Death's Majesty, is 5 mana for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. And yes, I know there's a lot of Planeswalker hype, and I already put I'm stumbling a lot. And finally, we're going to look at our only 10 in black. You've already seen the card, and I know it's a little bit cliche to put another Planeswalker as a 10 here, but I do think Liliana, Death's Majesty, really deserves this spot. Yes, I know Gideon was a 10 too, in my opinion, of course, but I think Liliana is a 10 as well. You're paying 5 mana for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker, which is pretty high, and Planeswalkers are not something you can often ignore in Limited unless you're already really far ahead, and you have to be pretty far ahead for Liliana not to make an impact on the board. Your +1 creates a 2/2 zombie and then mills 2 cards. That's a plus ability. Liliana gets bigger, or at least goes up in limit in loyalty, and you also get to put tokens on the board. Over the course of a couple turns, your opponent's going to fall really far behind if they're not able to keep up with Liliana. The -3 is also pretty good, letting you put any creature from your graveyard on the battlefield. It does make it a black zombie in addition to its other types, which isn't going to be relevant a good number of the times, but just getting your best creature back from the graveyard to the battlefield is a really nice bonus, and it does have a tiny little bit of synergy with the plus ability, which mills you for 2 cards, so if you happen to mill over one of your biggest bombs, you can -3 to get it back. And then the -7, while being a little bit of a lackluster ability, is probably more of a bonus for you than it is a detriment altogether. It's just -7 to destroy all non-zombie creatures. If your opponent's not in a black-white deck specifically, then this is probably just a one-sided board wipe, and you can set this up and draft around it to the point where you have a bunch of zombies. So I really like this card as a form of just card advantage as far as the tokens go over the course of a game. The -3 also being a form of card advantage as well. And then the destroy all non-zombies as being a kind of reset button if you manage to get there. Liliana is not unbeatable, not the most insane Planeswalker in the world, but I find it really hard to imagine a lot of scenarios where you beat Liliana just by playing a normal regular deck. You're going to need some pretty strong answers to deal with a Planeswalker that ticks up while also making tokens and then has a Wrath effect attached to it as well. So with that being said, that takes care of all of our black cards for the day. That puts us in the most aggressive color next time, red, and then we'll wrap up the mono colors with green last, and then we'll start looking at some of the multicolor and split cards and artifacts and fancy stuff that we can do in this format. So thank you again for joining me and watching me stumble over my review of these cards. I hope this was useful to you guys, especially with pre-release coming up. And again, if you have any kind of disagreements or anything that you would like to shout out and tell me I was wrong about, then do so in the comments below so we can talk about them. And until then, my name is Timothy, and I'll see you